The suit is dying. A few years back, I walked into what I thought was a business meeting dressed the way I'd always dressed for business meetings: navy suit, white shirt, proper shoes. The other guy arrived 12 minutes late in a gray hoodie, black joggers, and a pair of slides that looked like they'd been through a construction site. I remember glancing at his feet and genuinely wondering whether I had the wrong room. I assumed he was there to fix something. He was not there to fix something. He ran the company. He was worth, at minimum, a few $100 million, and he couldn't have been less interested in the fact that I was wearing a suit. The meeting went fine. I drove home in my navy suit, feeling like I'd shown up to a beach in a tuxedo. That moment stuck with me because I kept trying to work out whose logic was correct. Was I overdressed, or had he underdressed? The more I dug into that question, the more I started to understand that it wasn't really about clothing at all. The suit, for most of the 20th century, wasn't a style choice. It was a requirement, the uniform of anyone who wanted to be taken seriously in a professional context. We're talking the classic two-button blazer, notch lapel, trouser with a clean break at the shoe, the kind of thing Brooks Brothers had been selling since 1818, the kind of thing that dressed 40-plus American presidents and hung on the racks of Savile Row tailors who measured your shoulders before they'd even tell you the price. In 1948, the Clothing Manufacturers Association estimated that men's suit sales in the United States represented roughly $12.5 billion in revenue when adjusted for inflation. Men wore suits to the office, to sporting events, to restaurants, sometimes to the cinema. Choosing not to wear one wasn't a neutral act. It was a statement, and not a flattering one. If you want a cultural benchmark for what that era looked like, watch a few episodes of Mad Men. The show's entire visual grammar is built on the idea that a man in a sharp two-piece was simply what a serious man looked like. Then Silicon Valley happened, and the rules began to rot from the inside. The first companies to abandon the suit weren't rebels. They were children of the 1960s counterculture who'd grown up being told that a suit was the enemy, the uniform of conformity, of corporate obedience, of selling out. When Hewlett-Packard began quietly allowing casual dress on Fridays in the 1950s, it wasn't framed as a fashion decision. It was framed as a creativity decision. Structure inhibits innovation. Hierarchy is bad for engineering. Take off the tie and ideas flow better. Whether that was true or not almost doesn't matter, because it became the mythology of Silicon Valley, and the mythology spread. By the early 1980s, you could walk through an Apple office and see jeans, t-shirts, and sneakers, not business casual, actual clothes people wore on weekends, while the rest of corporate America was still in its suits, largely unaware that a different set of rules was being quietly written 2,000 miles away. Then Steve Jobs took a trip to Japan in the early 1980s, and everything changed. He visited Sony and met the company's chairman, Akio Morita. What caught his attention wasn't the products or the production lines, it was the uniforms. Every Sony factory worker wore the same jacket, designed specifically for Sony by the Japanese fashion designer Issey Miyake, a nylon piece with zippered sleeves that could be removed and converted into a vest. Jobs was captivated. He believed a shared uniform could build the same kind of cohesion at Apple, so he came back to the United States with samples, stood in front of his employees, and suggested they all wear them. He was booed, not metaphorically booed. His staff actively and loudly rejected the idea on the spot. Jobs, undeterred, called Miyake directly and asked him to make some of his black turtlenecks as a personal uniform for himself. Miyake, being either very generous or very good at reading a situation, made him over 100 of them. Jobs later showed the closet full of turtlenecks to his biographer Walter Isaacson. He said, "That's what I wear. I have enough to last for the rest of my life." The turtleneck was a masterpiece of image engineering. It projected minimalism, focus, artistic austerity, a man too consumed by great ideas to bother with fashion. What it did not project, and what almost no one mentioned at the time, was that the turtleneck was custom-made by one of the most celebrated couture designers in Japan. It was not a simple shirt. It was a costume of simplicity, handcrafted by a master, worn by a billionaire, sold to the public as the wardrobe of pure intellectual focus. Jobs became the most famous CEO on the planet wearing it, and an entire generation of founders absorbed the lesson, not just the aesthetic, but the logic underneath it. Caring about what you wear means you are not serious enough to have better things to care about. Meanwhile, the suit industry was absorbing pressure from a completely different direction, and that pressure had nothing to do with philosophy or Japanese couture. It had to do with khakis. In 1992, the marketing team at Levi Strauss produced an 8-page brochure called A Guide to Casual Business Wear. They printed 25,000 copies and mailed them directly to human resources departments across the United States. The brochure didn't look like a sales catalog. It looked like a style manual, a dress code policy document really, with photographs of professionals in pressed button-downs and loafers, captions explaining how to set the brake on a trouser leg, and notes on what distinguished smart casual from sloppy. Levi's also built a dedicated dress code hotline HR managers could call for advice, and produced videos for company cafeterias. None of it was overtly branded. Every photograph, though, featured Dockers khakis, a brand Levi's had recently acquired and was trying to move off golf courses and into office buildings. By 1995, the percentage of U.S. companies with casual dress codes had risen from around 66% to roughly 90%. Levi Strauss reported $6.2 billion in sales that year, up 10%. Dockers became the #1 khaki brand in America. The entire concept of business casual, the phrase, the category, the vocabulary that every HR policy in the country would use for the next 3 decades, had been invented and distributed by a denim company with a product to sell. HR managers across the country handed the brochure to their staff as though it were workplace guidance. It was a marketing pamphlet. I want to stop here for a second because this is the part of the story that I think most people miss. You probably grew up in a world where casual dress codes felt natural, like something that just happened as society modernized. But a significant slice of the professional wardrobe shift you've witnessed in your lifetime was engineered by a company that needed to move khakis. The man in the hoodie didn't arrive at his outfit through some spontaneous cultural evolution. He arrived there partly because a jeans manufacturer mailed a brochure to his HR department before he was born. Then Mark Zuckerberg walked onto the stage, and the last nail went in. In 2014, at his first ever public question and answer session, Zuckerberg was asked about the gray t-shirt. His answer was precise. I really want to clear my life to make it so that I have to make as few decisions as possible about anything except how to best serve this community. Decision fatigue, the psychological concept that every choice you make depletes the same finite mental resource, became his public justification. Cognitive load, the billionaire's productivity hack. The internet absorbed this with complete sincerity, and within a year you couldn't read a business publication without encountering some version of the argument that choosing your clothes was a waste of mental energy better spent on things that matter. The gray t-shirt Zuckerberg was wearing during that explanation was a custom-made garment from Brunello Cucinelli, costing between $300 and $400 each. He bought them in bulk. The man who'd convinced an entire generation that caring about clothes was intellectually beneath them was quietly spending more per t-shirt than most people spend on a full suit, while publicly explaining that clothing wasn't worth thinking about. $400 for the shirt that proved he didn't care about shirts. When Congress summoned Zuckerberg in 2018 over Cambridge Analytica, he arrived in a suit. The New York Times called it his "I'm sorry" suit. GQ described it as a sartorial dog collar, hiked up around his ears. The Washington Post noted the hair was cut so close it was more like penitence than grooming. The moment he needed the actual language of authority and contrition, he reached for the suit and wore it badly because he'd spent a decade pretending the suit didn't matter and had forgotten how it worked. The final chapter of this story didn't happen in Silicon Valley. It happened on Wall Street. By the early 2000s, as the finance and tech industries grew closer through the venture capital explosion that followed the dot-com boom, the Patagonia fleece vest had emerged as the tribal uniform of money. Elite conferences handed them out as swag with company logos embroidered on the chest. As historian Margaret O'Mara at the University of Washington described it, the vest hit the right sweet spot between East Coast money and West Coast casual, and that description tells you everything. Goldman Sachs branded Patagonia vests started appearing on secondary resale markets for between $200 and $340, sometimes more, depending on the prestige of the logo. You could resell a Goldman Sachs fleece vest for more than the cost of the suit it had replaced. Patagonia eventually cracked down on the whole program, announcing it would restrict its corporate wholesale arrangements to mission-driven companies that prioritize the planet. The outdoor gear brand had been turned into a status signal by the finance industry and eventually found the entire situation embarrassing enough to act on. The man I met in the gray hoodie and construction site slides had absorbed every layer of this history without knowing a single piece of it. The hoodie said, "I don't care about appearances, therefore I am serious." It said, "My time is too valuable to spend on getting dressed." It said, "I belong to the class of people for whom clothing is already solved." None of that was stated. All of it was communicated, and all of it had been engineered by a Japanese designer who made over 100 identical turtlenecks for a single client, by a jeans company that mailed 25,000 HR departments a brochure that looked like advice, and by a tech billionaire who spent $400 on a shirt to explain that shirts weren't worth spending money on. I still wore the suit home that day. I still think I was right to wear it.